Hello, welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Christopher Rice, and our guest today is Dr. Lorna Roth. Dr. Roth is Professor Emerita of the Communication Studies Department at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. She focuses her research and teaching on international communication, indigenous television, oral histories, and the relationship between media and race. Her most recent effort, the Color Balance Project, investigates racialized imagery and skin color representations in consumer products and media. Today, Dr. Roth will discuss this project, why the state of race in product development is important, and what consumers and producers can do to mitigate bias in the future. Lorna, thanks a lot for coming in to speak with us.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
The Color Balance Project, Lorna, it examines the way in which skin color has been expressed and manipulated in consumer products and media. Can you elaborate on the details of this project and how does racial bias influence consumer products and vice versa?
Sure. It's a very, very large project.
Mm-hmm.
It's taken me many years to do the research because of its multiple case studies that I'm looking at. Initially, the project is about the way in which skin color is imagined, embedded, or inserted into, and color adjusted in products and technologies that have a sense of flesh as central to their design. And what I'm looking at is what happens when manufacturers recognize that not all skin is light, or some say white, which is, a very complicated term. And so I'm looking at two big areas, technologies and products. In the technologies, I'm looking at film, stock film, emulsions, the chemistry of stock film. But my main focus in the research project to date has been on the visual industries.
Yes.
And, but that's not the only thing. I'm studying skin color in many of its manifestations in products. I'm studying mannequin skin colors, doll skin colors, nylon stockings, like what is nude in nylon stockings. I'm studying prosthetics or artificial limbs and artificial or devices to enhance certain features like hearing aids. What color are hearing aids? Do they match black skin or darker skin? I'm studying the crayon industry, and I've particularly focused on the ways in which the color flesh, which was named as a Crayola crayon in 1949, had evolved into a particular kind of historical set of changes. So in 1962, for example, the civil rights movement complained that the color flesh, which was really kind of pinkish and peachy colored, did not in any way address the color of dark skin.
Right.
And they lobbied Crayola, or Eastman, in Eastman, Pennsylvania, Benny and Smith, who was the company, to take away that name and replace it with something else. So that if you buy a Crayola box collection now, the color peach is the color that flesh was originally, and they changed it to peach. So anything that really has a notion of flesh embedded in it, Band-Aids, for example. I found in 1996 a Band-Aid product that had been targeted toward black skin. And it was a very interesting product. There were 3 levels of blackness and brownness embedded in those Band-Aids. But after a while, the Band-Aid companies got caught onto this, and it was a bit, I guess they figured it was a bit expensive, and they started doing abstract Band-Aids, Disney pictures, or little cartoons.
Yeah.
And now what they're doing is transparent Band-Aids, so that whatever color your skin is shown.
That way it's always flesh colored, right?
Yes, it's always flesh colored. And I'm looking also more recently at algorithms and how algorithms are designed, because in all the cases that I'm talking about, the designer is always apparent in the design.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the recognition that there are values embedded in the design that relate to the people who designed it.
Yes.
And it raises a whole series of questions about neutrality of technologies, etc.
Yeah.
But so those are some of the areas I'm studying. But the area that I've most developed are the products related to photography and skin color. So I started thinking about that because I, like most people, felt, well, you know, when you take a picture, it is an exact replica or a rendering of who you are, what you look like. And all of your fine details on your face, for example, if you have wrinkles or, you know, whatever, they will show.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. That was not the case with the early analog film emulsions. They did not render features, final features of dark skin very clearly. And what often happened was that there was a lot of blackness on the face. You could see the whites of people's eyes and the whites of their teeth, but you didn't see the details. Mm. And it became particularly bad when you had to do pictures of darker skinned and lighter skinned people in the same frame. Because there you have issues around, there are some issues around physics and lighting, but the film itself didn't have the range to capture the contrasts in the same frame effectively.
Yeah. One of these issues that you're studying in the time frame that you've looked at, what are the broader societal effects you think this has had on people when, you know, the skin tones are not rendered appropriately in different either products or media that you're seeing? What are the effects of this on people?
That's a really important question. The effects are very negative in terms of self-identification. If there's a universal standard, mm-hmm. and they're developed a universal standard in the form of what is called the Shirley color balance cards. A Shirley card was a card of an image of women. The first woman was white and blonde, blue-eyed, with all sorts of color bars in the background and grayscale and, you know, all the features that the photo industries and visual industries thought were necessary to mm-hmm. be taken into account. Everything other than skin color. And they were used to calibrate the in the printing process, to calibrate the colors so that they would match, the person in the image would match as close as possible to the ideal skin tone of the Shirley card, which was white mm-hmm. skinned. And they were what I studied because I found that the Shirley cards were emblematic of the certain kind of aesthetic that was predominant at a particular historical period. Okay? And so if there's one universal standard, and that standard we still have legacies of that standard. You still see the residual embeddedness of the whiteness in a lot of the film industry. Well, if you only have one universal standard, and that's the ideal skin tone standard for the world. It was for the world. It was for Africa, Asia, India, South America. It was for the world, that universal standard of white skin. And there were all sorts of justifications from a physics perspective about why that worked a certain way because of the light reflectivity on the hair and this and that, and on the skin. If you're not white, then what are the makers to do about dealing with the problems that persist?
Right.
And they didn't know what to do. So you were like a deviation from the norm if you were not the normal, which was white, Shirley cards. And so what happens in that case is that people who are dark-skinned, Afro-Americans, Africans, Native North Americans who have darker skin tones would always feel neglected, would always feel that if they took pictures of their families, they would look awful.
It's not the same, yeah.
They would look awful.
And you see the same thing in products as well, right?
Yeah, Exactly. Well, if you don't see yourself, if you are an absence in the public, popular culture sphere of products and consumer products and technologies, you were alienated, you were marginalized. And that has been used as a basis for the development of a concept called the color complex. And the color complex refers to the notion that even in the the Afro-American communities or the darker skinned communities, there is intra-racial discrimination.
Yeah.
So, it's not just people cross-culturally who discriminate against each other or against the darker skinned communities, but it's intra-racially. And what happens out of that, and this is where the damage comes from in response to your question, they realize that the lighter the skin you have, the more likely you are to do better in business, to feel more beautiful and be regarded as more beautiful, to experience more privilege, and to experience more opportunity. So it's really, that does lots of damage to people's self-identity and to people's sense of community, and it's a very, very difficult position to be in. There was a company that was hired to advertise. It was an advertising company, and they recruited clients, and two of their clients complained very strongly about the lack of ability to demonstrate the distinction between light brown and dark brown. So who were they? Chocolate companies who complained that they couldn't see the difference between dark chocolate and light chocolate, and a furniture company that couldn't distinguish between the lightness of the wood grains of their furniture and the darkness of the wood grains.
Yeah.
And so when I was speaking to the people at Kodak who were working in this area at the time, and they were still working at Kodak, now they're retired or passed away, but at the time, it was in the late 90s, they were able to say that, incidentally, when we made the color adjustments and increased the dynamic range of browns, we added more browns to the chemistry, which had been designed initially for only white skin. We noticed that the ethnic people looked a lot better after they were being photographed.
You've suggested the best method to remove skin color bias is a concept of cognitive equity. Could you explain exactly what cognitive equity means and how it differs from other strategies to embrace diversity?
Sure, certainly. But when we talk about embracing diversity, usually we talk about the surface things, like what we see on screens. That's really important. It's another aspect of the issue I'm dealing with, but it's not what I'm focusing on, because I've written much about that in terms of diversity on screens related to indigenous peoples in Canada, and related to peoples of different skin colors around the world. But who is on the screen? Who is behind the screen? Who is in the boardrooms? And how that all works. Usually it's related to policies of diversity, related to legislation, related to quotas and statistical counting of how many people are given opportunities for employment, etc. And that's really, really important. And that's part of the real world. But what I'm talking about are the secrets of the manufacturers that you don't hear much about. The lab workers and what the lab workers are doing in the labs and what they know, their knowledge, and who is making the policies in the boardrooms that enable equity to take place in employment opportunities, but who's making the technical decisions that will create opportunities for people on a more personal level to feel that there is an aesthetic justice going on in terms of what they can do themselves at home to create beautiful images. That they don't have to go through all these fancy, compensatory mechanisms. And that's really, really important, okay? So the standard sort of approach to diversity is the first, like representation on screen, off screen, employment opportunities. But what I'm talking about is a deeply embedded sense of unconsciousness, or what somebody that an academic named Joyce King calls disconsciousness. And disconsciousness is it's a low level of awareness that, maybe what they're doing is not so hot, and not so positive, but they do it anyways, And I'm trying to tackle the fixedness of some of the thinking around technology. That because it's technology and it's supposedly neutral, which it isn't.
Bias isn't everything.
Yes. So cognitive equity is my way of saying that rather than having this singular standard of lightness embedded as your model, which leads to all sorts of personal and psychological problems, and physics problems as well, why not create a film that has the entire range of skin tones embedded directly into the emulsions, embedded directly into the digital camera options of what colors can be shown on this continuum. Create a product like that which Philips and Ikegami created in Europe and Japan together to address the problem of dark and light skin in the same camera frame, for television particularly, because television is where it often happens, that there are people of mixed color skinned talking to each other, and create a camera that can deal with it, create film that can deal with it, the range in film and the various kinds of ranges in digital cameras. But what I found when I was in Holland, in Breda, Holland, and talking to Philips, which is now Thomson, that in 1994 they invented a solution to television studio cameras, the LDK series, it's called, in which they have embedded a capture and storage chip, and they've embedded two of those capture and storage computer chips into their camera system. One of those chips deals with the range of whiteness colors, or colors related to white and beige moving toward the browns, and they use the kind of technology that Photoshop used in terms of transforming and expanding colors and all this. They use they came out at about the same time as Photoshop came out, so it's kind of interesting. So on the one hand, one chip deals with the lighter skin, the other chip deals with the darker skins, and the range of tones in the darker skins, and that has made such a difference. Because before, and one of the things that I heard, an anecdote from the people who were working on this, who were creating this camera, they said to me, and I won't use names, but they said there were, when there are dark skinned and light skinned people in the same screen, in the past, they would have to capture the dark person with one camera, capture the light person with another camera, and do a lot of editing to get them to, they tried to do a kind of continuity, like they measured and whatever. It was very complicated. And so if they were sitting at the same table, they would have to make sure that they looked like they were sitting at the same table because they were captured by different cameras. And they had to do all these compensatory things because the cameras didn't have that ability. Since that ability has been integrated in the infrastructure, Oprah bought the camera, apparently. Oprah's company bought the camera. BET, Black Entertainment Television, bought the camera. Univision bought the camera. And people in various parts of the world brought the cameras that had that infrastructure in it. And it became so popular, and people saw it was so worthy, that they started producing cameras on the consumer market, not just the prosumer market, but they started embedding this infrastructure into the various cameras that companies bought it that could afford it, but I think in many of the popular cameras now, there is much better handling of color balance because of those changes.
Is this changing kind of the disconsciousness that you were talking about earlier? Is this having an effect?
I think so, certainly. Yeah. By the way, I call this phenomenon the embedding of the ranges into the materiality of the technologies and the products. I call that the ability to help promote cognitive equity. Cognitive equity means equity, equality. Not exact equality, because there are all sorts of conditions and circumstances that tailor it in a different way. But by cognitive equity, I mean like that the cognitions, the way in which we think, the patterns of our thinking that are so deeply embedded in our consciousness or in our unconsciousness that we naturalize them, we make them feel like they're the only option we have. That changes from looking at a singular concept of it to a multiple levels of consciousness.
And so it could just take a little push to get there.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Lorna, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're
fascinating
very welcome.
Stuff.
You're very welcome.
That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's C-I-B-E-R, CIBER at indiana.edu.